Hey everyone, Frank Gonzalez here. This is the Gunsallus Standard podcast. I have a special guest today. I'm on the road. I am with my good friend Fitzgerald Mofor. He's running for delegate for District 9A.
Correct, yes.
And it's Howard County. Correct. And part of Montgomery as well.
Correct. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, yeah. Well, Fitz, you were a standout linebacker and an all-conference at UAB. Mm-hmm. In that role, you have to read the whole field and react instantly.
Correct.
How does that defensive playmaker mindset translate to the work you're doing now in Maryland politics?
Absolutely. Part of being a linebacker is you have to be a very cerebral player, someone that also exudes a lot of confidence and also has very strong leadership skills. And as the linebacker, you're essentially the quarterback of the defense. So you have to get your defensive linemen, get them lined up in their proper gaps, make sure that the defensive backs, they also have received the correct play call that the coach has actually signaled in. And you essentially have to know every single thing that everyone is doing on the field, and then also be a savant on what the offense is essentially trying to do to attack the defense. And, that helped me a lot in, government affairs, advocacy, hopefully public policy making too, if we are successful in our race. Because, in public policy making, obviously you have to be very cerebral and forward thinking and very attentive on, what are the actual effects of the bills and legislation that you'd like to implement. And then you also need to be very cognitively aware of what your opponents are going to do to deter that legislation. And then, in football, there isn't any negotiation with the other side. You're just trying to defeat them and bring their will. Yeah. But, in politics, it's a little bit different, especially in the halls of government. You have to do some bipartisan negotiation on things that are really just common sense and really good governance measures that are for the betterment of your constituents. And really leadership. Leadership is a really, really big thing. I just remember football, a lot of the younger guys too, also spending a lot of time at UAB looking up to some of the older guys and to lead them into the right direction. And that's something that we want to do in public policy making too also, is to be very good leaders and making sure that we aren't leading our constituents astray and doing the things that are in their best interest. So I see a lot of commonalities with the skills from football and politics and public policy making now.
All right, that makes complete sense to me. I played sports as well in college. So, lacrosse, I was a goalie. So it's sort of like being a quarterback.
Yes, exactly.
And communication is, of utmost importance in that dynamic. But Correct. So you've made it your mission to restore Maryland. And as someone who grew up here, what was the specific moment you realized that being a private citizen wasn't enough and that you did need to jump in and get involved?
So I remember I came back home from UAB. At first, I taught at this very rural community in a school called Grove Hill High School. And I figured that coaching and teaching isn't necessarily my calling, something that I really felt. I was like, I want to better my community that I actually grew up in. So I came home, I did my master's in law in Washington, St. Louis, spent a little bit of time on different campaigns, worked in the General Assembly very briefly as a liaison for a state senator in my hometown in Brookville and Olney, and also ran for school board, became a member of the Montgomery County Republican Central Committee and also the Montgomery County Taxpayers League. And during this time, it really was an actual rude awakening in how much Maryland is in desperate need of balance. As everyone knows, we are a Democrat state, so to speak, but actually a lot of the voters are fiscally conservative and socially moderate. And I'm seeing that the lawmakers are actually way more to the left than actually the body politic and rank and file voter in Maryland. You see things, as we were just talking about earlier, the expansion of government, $2 billion in new taxes, this very religious-like commitment to green energy that we know isn't necessarily sustainable and can actually power our energy needs right now, especially with the new erection of data centers coming all over the PJM grid. And I'm like, wow, we need some common sense lawmakers to actually come here in Maryland and Annapolis and, balance things out philosophically. And rather than being so committed to a specific ideology, being committed to more so of pragmatism. And, spending that time in local and state government and seeing some of the things that are going on, I was like, Fitz, you really need to get involved and do something here. So last summer, as you say, I did the Restore Maryland thing. And I really wanted to connect with inactive voters, people who are disengaged with the political process and feel that government no longer works for them. And I'll just go door to door, talk to them, what's stopping you from voting, and giving them the tools to actually have them go out and exercise their constitutional rights. And we registered a few voters too also. And it was really just a great opportunity to connect with a lot of people in the community. So it was such a good time.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I was following that closely, so it's really cool to see someone take that initiative and own it. A lot of people talk about doing stuff, and you just did it. So, I really respect that.
I appreciate it.
So you went back for a Master of Law, specifically to understand the complexities of public policy.
Yeah.
What is one piece of legislation or a fine print item in Annapolis right now that should be a major red flag for every Marylander?
The BRFA bill, the Budget and Reconciliation Financing Act, and the budget bill, which is a tandem bill together. And essentially is that, according to the Maryland Constitution, the legislator is required to balance the budget every single legislative session. And in this legislative session, essentially what the lawmakers are going to do to balance this $1.5 billion deficit is to make some budget tricks and some budget gimmicks to avoid new taxes in an election year. So they're going to take about maybe $300 million from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund. They're probably going to take about 150, not probably, it's actually signed into law right now. The governor signed it yesterday. $150 million from the Rainy Day Fund, maybe another $150 million from the Income Tax Reserve Fund too also, and a few other budget shifts and budget gimmicks, so to speak, and unfortunately draconian cuts of $125 million to the Developmental Disability Administration. And they're doing this. This is essentially what someone would call an election budget. So they do these budget gimmicks, do these tricks, avoid new taxes. But the problem is that Maryland has structural issues long term. Right. About a $3 billion deficit in the next fiscal year and a $4 billion deficit by 2030. Now, the Budget and Reconciliation and Financing Act, the budget bill, is a tool that lawmakers can use to provide tax relief to families in Maryland and also address long-term structural issues. So that is the most important piece of legislation right now in this session, just about actually every session. And, I was really happy that I was able to go to WashU in St. Louis because they were able to teach us, the fundamental practice of how government actually works, the procedures, the steps, how it comes out of committee with the Budget and Taxation Committee or the Appropriations Committee, and, goes first and second and third reader on the House floor and the Senate floor, and then they cross-file on crossover day, and then it goes through conference committee too to make some final adjustments, and then the governor signs it. So I was happy to go through the WashU because they were able to teach us some of those things, and I really want to get my hand on that BRFA bill, hopefully if we're elected this fall.
Cool. Well, so we've seen a rise in crime and recidivism across the state.
Yes.
How do we balance being smart on crime with ensuring our communities actually feel safe again?
Yeah.
And what is the common sense fix Annapolis is ignoring?
So, unfortunately right now, the juvenile justice system in Maryland is broken. And post-pandemic, we've actually saw a very high spike in juvenile crime. I mean, crimes with handguns went up 220%. Auto theft went up by 64%. Even juvenile complaints increased by 15% or so. And the biggest problem is that right now, the juvenile justice system doesn't provide services for children that offend, and it's actually very ripe for recidivism to actually thrive and offenders to continue to go through in and out the juvenile justice system. Essentially what happens is that when a juvenile interfaces with the police officers and they're arrested, a lot of the times they go to a DJS facility where there's an intake specialist, and they use an instrument called DREA. And they determine, if this child is maybe a threat to public safety, if they have maybe a repeated history of interfacing with the juvenile justice system, or maybe they can actually get released, or they may have to get detained to see a juvenile judge or juvenile court. But the problem is that typically this instrument is not used correctly, and typically two things will happen. They will actually release the child back to their supposed guardian, or they'll put this GPS ankle monitoring system. Unfortunately, that is proven to be ineffective. And they go through different vendors and contractors to actually facilitate these GPS ankle monitoring systems. And the problem is that when this child actually violates the terms of their home detention, the company or the vendor that actually facilitates the GPS ankle monitoring system, they don't do their due diligence of contacting law enforcement, whether it's local police, the state's attorney's office, or what have you. So you have a lot of children that are repeatedly committing crime too also. And that's also kind of with some of the philosophy with the old secretary, Vincent Girardi, and thankfully for the public, for the benefit of public safety, he's been fired or resigned or whatever that argument is. So we have a new one, Betsy Fox Tolentino, and her policy is that if there's a child that has an ankle monitor on that commits a crime, they get automatic detention. But the problem is that with the Department of Juvenile Services, as I said earlier, there isn't a strong, robust services. Children need maybe rehabilitation centers, vacational learning, and a lot of the parents or guardians, they've shown that they don't possess the ability to actually monitor and supervise this child. So now that child should become a responsibility to the state, and the state should actually provide somewhat of a boarding school-like settings to make sure that this child isn't continuously a burden on society with committing crime. Now they have this bill in Annapolis that is going to the governor's desk that probably signed into law, where the youngest age you can charge a juvenile as an adult is 16 years old. And essentially, you will even have someone who's at the age of 14 or 15, they can take a firearm, pistol whip someone, undergo first degree assault, unfortunately, and still will not be charged as an adult. The biggest problem is that, as we talked about earlier, the juvenile justice system isn't necessarily equipped to take on more and more caseloads too also. And some people say, oh, that's a Republican talking point. Just about every single state's attorney in Maryland, Democrat state's attorneys, even John McCarthy, hopefully I'm saying his name correctly, in Montgomery County, he opposes this legislation. Ivan Bates, who's essentially the chair of the Maryland State's Attorney Association, is actually gone against this legislation and actually said, how about let's implement this in 3 years, fix the juvenile justice system first, and then maybe we can actually implement some of these policies. And the problem is that actually in DJS, you have situations where children are subject to sexual abuse. Legislation a couple years ago, the Child Victim Act actually removed the statute on limitation on sexual assault charges. So you have kids from 20 years ago, 15 years ago that unfortunately were raped or sexually assaulted in juvenile justice facilities are actually suing the state of Maryland, and it could be up to $60 billion. We have outdated systems like Assist that doesn't actively track recidivism. You have children in facilities where they live amongst mice, rats, unsanitary food, and then we're giving these vendors money without proper documentation, and we bypassing regular procurement law, so to speak. So juvenile justice is out of control, and it's completely broken.
It is.
And those are the things I'd like to fix. And I could go on some of the solutions, but I've already been talking.
Right. Well, we were discussing a little bit before we hopped on. I was telling you about someone I know, and I'm not going to say who they are and the position they were running for.
Yeah.
We are in Fells Point recording right now, and this incident actually happened in Highlandtown earlier this week, where they live. Mm-hmm. And they were walking home. They were about a block from their house, and they noticed that two teenage males walking across the street.
Yeah.
And one started pulling up the mask over, and then had a gun in his hand.
Yeah.
And so with the children, they start running home.
Yeah.
And they get to their door, opening the door, and then the accomplice with the person that was chasing them, I guess, realized that it was let's go. And so they luckily, by the grace of God, were able to safely get home and have no incident. But they're withdrawing from their race, and they're looking to move. So it's a very stark reality in Maryland, especially here in Baltimore.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something. To me, recidivism is something that really, really needs to be addressed, and the fact that it's something you're passionate about, I think speaks volumes about you as well. When you ran for the Board of Education in Montgomery County, you campaigned against administrative malfeasance. For the parents in Talbot County, where I live, and across the state, what does that look like in practice, and how do we shift power back to the classroom?
So the two things with administrative malfeasance, especially in education locally. One, I think that the size of the bureaucratic offices in education are too high. I mean, even places like in Montgomery County, we actually, I would say about nearly 50% of the operating budget of the expenditures are going to salaries, payroll, pensions, benefits, those type of things. And unfortunately, a lot of the money that's needed in education doesn't trickle down to classrooms. And then the other part of some of the administrative malfeasance is that there was an issue a few years ago where there was a principal from Pink Branch. I forget his first name, Bideman was the last name, and he essentially had a very long history of sexually harassing his staffers, to also making lewd comments, showing unexpectedly at people's homes, clearly inebriated with alcohol. And this was essentially coming out. We've seen some of the bureaucrats in Montgomery County Public Schools go to very far extents to suppress the story, also suppress accountability too also, and do things to make sure that this guy, Biederman, is actually removed from the public school system.
So he's still in?
No, he's no longer. No longer. This happened in about 2023 or so. Right. So that's some of the issues that we're seeing with bureaucratic malfeasance, and I'm sure the list can go on and on and on too also. And then another thing that I see with some of the bureaucratic malfeasance with some of these school superintendents that are allowing these local budgets to get out of control. Every single year, Montgomery County continues to fund the school system well over the maintenance of effort requirements. We're seeing actually a dip in public school enrollment, but school funding is increasing, right, which is just not making any sense at all. And as we see performance maybe even flatlining, and if not even declining in some instances, and every single fiscal year, you see these school superintendents, we gotta fully fund public education. I mean, in the next couple of years, Montgomery County public school budget is gonna be, $5 billion? When are we gonna stop? $10 billion, $15 billion. When are we gonna stop? So that's some of the issues that we're seeing with some of the administrative malfeasance in public education. And I'm sure a lot of the progressives and liberals in Montgomery County will disagree with me, and there's so many different programs and social services that we need for public education. But, at the end of the day, public school is for learning and educational achievement. And that should be the biggest focus that I also believe a lot of the administrators in public education are no longer focusing on.
Right. Wow. Well, yeah, it's interesting seeing stuff that's coming out about how the state is looking to also impact private schools.
Yes.
And I saw something yesterday. I didn't get to dig into it too deeply, but also wanting to affect curriculum for homeschools.
Correct.
That's it's pretty interesting times that we're living through. And how do you? What's your take on that?
So yes, excuse me, Maryland, especially MSDE, they want to actually dictate what is going on in private schools and homeschools too also. I think the legislation may have died. I could be wrong. But there was a law legislation in years previous where they wanted to actually dictate curriculum in homeschools, make sure that the teachers in homeschools have an actual teaching degree, which is really ironic because teachers without teaching certificates are actually increasing in Maryland. Mm-hmm. And the Maryland government, to fill a lot of the teaching vacancies, they actually have filled those vacancies with teachers that aren't qualified because they don't possess the prerequisite background education to actually teach and give our students a very strong and great education. And another thing that they're doing now too also that is very well still alive in this session is to actually start suing private schools for not actually having gender ideology within their curriculum or supposedly discriminating against certain students. And we know what that necessarily means. So it's somewhat dystopian what lawmakers in Maryland are trying to do in terms of their invasive policies on homeschools and private schools. And you have very strong institutes and nonprofits like the Maryland Family Institute that is very, very brave, that fights on behalf of a lot of Maryland families to kind of block some of those legislations. So I'm happy with some of the good work that they're doing, and I'll give Jeff Trimbath a shout out. Some of the great things he's doing with Alexander, one of their lead attorneys too also. Yeah, those guys are helping us out a lot.
I would say so. Just to shift a little bit, still impacting families, but pretty much everyone. Yeah. Energy costs are hitting everyone right now.
Yes.
And you've talked about pragmatic energy solutions.
Yes.
How do we lower bills for the average family or individual without compromising the reliability of our grid?
So Maryland right now, especially with energy, has a very strong supply and demand issue. And I'm sure everyone knows that we're part of this PJM interconnectivity grid with 13 other states. So some of their actions on energy also actually affects us too. For example, Northern Virginia is doing a good job, I would say, of actually, strengthening their economy with the data centers. And they've been running up these very large budget surpluses and bringing in a lot of revenue with some of the data centers. And we're also bringing data centers in Maryland. And here's the biggest problem. These data centers require a lot of energy too also. So there's a increasingly high demand with low supply. And over the last 10 years or so in Maryland, our lawmakers with legislation like the Climate Solutions Now Act and the Clean Energy and Jobs Now Act, and our participation in RGGI and also the Sierra Club, also suing some of the power plant facilities, they've actually caused them to close down in Maryland because a lot of these companies believe it's no longer profitable to operate here under those conditions. And we're also seeing places like Dickerson and Montgomery County that's now going to be kind of like a data center / incinerator kind of facility. And 40% of our energy is actually imported into the state of Maryland from Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and they're using fossil fuels and natural gas. So the lawmakers here are very committed to solar and wind, which doesn't necessarily meet our energy demands and needs. So what Maryland needs right now, first and foremost, is new power plant and energy generation here in Maryland. Yes, natural gas and fossil fuels. I'm sorry to the climate alarmists. Those things are a necessity right now. So when we have new energy and more energy generation in Maryland to actually meet the needed supply with this increased demand, everyone would actually see lower costs long term. We also need to pull out of things like RGGI, which RGGI is essentially a carbon tax on ratepayers. And what it does is essentially tries to cap CO2 emissions on power plants and try to eliminate 65% of it by 2030, 2035 or something like that. And when energy companies aren't moving closer enough to supposedly renewable energy or clean energy, as they like to call it, they actually find these energy generation companies, and the energy generation companies, they pay into the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, and they also have alternative compliance payments too also, that they are actually, that goes into the Strategic Energy Investment Fund with these green energy mandates. Now, the problem is that just like any business, when the government increases taxes or fees, they're not gonna eat it. They're going to pass it off to the consumer. So RGGI, we actually have to withdraw from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We have to end the Empower program, which is essentially a surcharge that charges ratepayers for using their own energy. And ostensibly, they say it goes to funding for more cleaner energy or helping people who are low to moderate income families to help in the system with their energy bills, which are great things, and I can see how that can be noble. Right. But ultimately, if we end the Empower program, that surcharge, everyone would automatically see a $25, $30, even maybe $40 reduction on their energy bills every single month. And so those are the essentially three things. We got to withdraw from RGGI, end the Empower program, and create more energy generation and bring more power plants back online here in Maryland.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting to hear from your perspective, because so I live in Easton, and I, as you're aware, served as town council president there for some time. So I was able to see behind the curtain on a lot of the operations. Yes. So in Easton, we have Easton Utilities, and we have our own generators that create our electricity for our town. Yeah. So, and there are 5 municipal utilities like that in the state of Maryland. And when everything that you're talking about loses power, the onus actually is mandated by law for these municipal utilities to try and feed electricity back to the state, the rest of the state. Yeah. And I mean, to like with financial penalties if they don't deliver. Correct. So it's interesting to hear the perspective of probably 99.9% of the state, having being impacted more than those 5 towns really with their own utilities. We are still impacted, by market forces and things like that. We don't get away from that. Yeah. And so, I mean, it is what it is. Fuel's fuel. Yeah. But it's just, seeing what happens everywhere else around the state's really, really concerning, and how some ideas like that could end up getting translated down to the local level, just through lobbying efforts and things like that. And we definitely, had people, approach us and try and talk to, so it's like, no, please go away. So let's shift over to the state budget. It's grown, to an exorbitant amount. Yeah. As a business owner, where do you see the most fat that needs to be cut so we can provide actual tax relief to families and seniors on fixed incomes?
So there are actually 3 things. It's 1, the Maryland Blueprints for the Future, the size of state government. Actually, 4 things. Blueprint for the Future, state government, Medicaid, and a lot of the waste, fraud, and abuse that goes on in Annapolis. So there are 4 things. So let's start with Medicaid too. Okay. Medicaid, the state government is going to spend about $17 billion, and it's ballooning and it's increasing because Maryland has a very progressive system in terms of eligibility. Now, I understand how it could be somewhat political poison to talk about reducing Medicaid depending on some of the policies that you want to implement and putting more eligibility restrictions too also. And we can talk about that too also, but things that I know for sure we can actually get some bipartisan support on is one, the Maryland Blueprints for the Future. Something that we spend about $3 to $4 billion annually and $30 billion over 10 years. So it's essentially an unfunded mandate. And next year, the funding source that's dedicated specifically for the blueprint is ending. And this is all going to go into the general fund. So, and that's one of the big reasons why actually Moody's credit agency downgraded us to AA instead of AAA, because they said, this blueprint for the future is budget strapped in the state of Maryland. So to actually fix the blueprint for the future is they need to change the funding formula. Maryland has a system where they count students day one. On the first day of school. That would sometimes be towards the end of August, first day of September, and those amount of students that show up on the first day would determine the funding levels for the next year. Right. Problem is that a lot of kids don't come back to school throughout the year. So Maryland has spent about almost $1 billion on ghost students in the last 5 years or so, and it's probably going to continue to balloon. So Maryland actually reform and change how they count students, and would be able to save a bunch of money there too also. It's been delayed now, but in about 3 or 4 years, they're actually going to change the planning time to 40% for teachers. And what that's going to require is about 15,000 new teachers, which will cost state government $1.5 billion. Also for salaries, pensions, benefits, those type of things. The problem is that, with such a large ask, we don't have the necessary revenue. We don't have the revenues to match that high spending and lofty spending goals that the state government has. So with the Maryland Blueprint for the Future, we actually really have to reform that there. And then the administrative side, the bureaucratic sides of Maryland is we have to decrease the size of state government too. For the first time ever in 2024, state payroll got up to $5 billion, which is just way too high. So we have to make some strategic cuts there for all non-essential workers and administrators here in Maryland. And the waste, fraud, and abuse. The State Highway Administration actually authorized $360 million in projects that were supposedly federally funded, but they didn't get any federal approval for it. So over the next couple of years, that's actually going to have to get funded through the Transportation Trust Fund or in the general fund. And you see about 10 different agencies where they've done something very similar, and there's about $4 billion or so in waste and government fraud too. So those are some things that moving forward, Maryland state government really has to get serious about tackling. Once they eliminate those superfluous costs and waste, then we would be able to go on the back end and provide the tax relief for middle-class families too also. Okay. Yeah.
All right, so let's hone back in on your turf. So District 9A, much like Talbot County, is a unique mix of suburban growth and agricultural roots.
Yes.
How do we modernize our infrastructure without steamrolling the rural character that makes our communities special?
Absolutely. So there's a very big thing, a law and a legislation such as RECA. And essentially RECA overrides local zoning for solar farms, and actually streamlines permitting too as well for solar companies to come in and actually turn some of these farmlands into solar farms to create more energy generation in Maryland. Western Howard County, Lisbon, Glenelg, West Friendship, those type of things, which are in District 9A, and even Damascus, are very rural communities that has an abundance of farmland too also. So while I understand the importance of energy generation in Maryland, which it's actually probably the number one issue, the preservation for farmland is just as important too also. We don't want to actually mess up the local agro economy, and we also don't want to lead to and jeopardize food stability too also, which can even make grocery prices go up, which is a very big issue right now, as you know. So I think that Maryland, instead of going into parts of my district, which I love so much, and actually door knocking thousands of doors and talking to people, a lot of people also oppose some of these things too as well. They also don't want the transmission lines going through the farmland too also. So I think that Maryland should repurpose some of the closed down facilities too also, and make those power plant facilities that generate more energy also. And I know nuclear takes a long time, 10 to 15 years to actually have the SMRs, the small modular reactors, to actually work and transmit some of that nuclear energy. But it's something that we actually have to start moving towards for the future. Calvert Cliffs, I believe, is the only nuclear facility that we have. You know, we should have maybe about 1 or 2 more long term for clean and reliable energy. So that's a very big issue for District 9A, the preservation of farmland and the local agroeconomy and those type of things.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So even though you are running in 9A, the issues you're fighting for resonate on the Eastern Shore. Yeah. Why is this so important for the next generation of conservative leaders to work together across county lines?
Because we're going to take back Maryland. And sometimes when I say that, people look at me like I'm crazy. Yeah. Like, where do you get this optimism from? Yeah. And I think the next generation, people like myself, like you, who are leaders of the Eastern Shore, and hopefully I can be a leader one day. On the more suburban, rural side of this side of Maryland. Us working together, campaigning together, can really, and messaging too is a really big important thing, is to show the next generation of Marylanders that conservatism isn't dead in Maryland. And as a matter of fact, we're very energized, invigorated, and we're going to bring back change here in Maryland. And it's going to have to be done. It can't be done unilaterally. It's going to have to be a cohesive team effort. And I really think it's important for the Maryland Republican Party to unify from the Eastern Shore of Maryland and Easton, all the way to Germantown and Montgomery County, Maryland. That way, when you have a cohesive and united Republican Party, we can put together very strong candidates all up and down the ballot too, and actually affect public policy making in Maryland, in your municipal level, the county council level, over there in Annapolis, and actually deliver that real change that a lot of Marylanders are longing for. And I see a lot of young guys. I'll shout them out a couple. Dominic Martin is doing this thing over there in Baltimore County. Alex Harlan too, also. Yahoo Blackwell. And Mark Fisher, my running mate Spencer Rhoda. And if I'm missing out anyone, please forgive me. What's this guy? What's his name? How did I forget his name? He's running for county council in Montgomery County, District 1. Reardon Sullivan in Montgomery County was the previous chair for the MCGOP, or Esther Wells. There's a bunch of them that are really young conservatives that are doing things all up and down the ballot. Some really great ideas. So it's very important for all of us to work together to actually effectuate change here in Maryland.
I agree. Yeah. And as we touched on earlier, communication is everything.
Absolutely.
And, I think it's really important for that to occur, so we can know, well, what's happening where you live, what are you seeing, how is that, how are laws in Annapolis actually being implemented and enforced where you actually live. Because most politics is local at the end of the day. So what I'm trying to do with this show, and from your perspective, what does the Gunsallus Standard look like for a restored Maryland?
So the Gunsallus Standard for Restored Maryland is a change in media and communication for Republicans and conservatives in Maryland, getting the word out, connecting with other influential members and community leaders too also. And the thing that I've been the most impressed with you and the Gunsallus Standard, especially for Restored Maryland, is that aspect of proliferating new media. Sometimes the Banner, the Baltimore Banner, the Baltimore Sun, or Montgomery, Bethesda, and I'm not familiar with some of the local publications on the Eastern Shore, but we see a clear and obvious bias in terms of coverage and communicating with the Republican and conservative candidates. Maybe to them, they believe that we're irrelevant because we haven't had a track record of winning in Maryland, or what have you, even though I would push back on that. There's actually a very strong track record of Republicans winning in Maryland. I mean, Larry Hogan was elected twice. Right. Governor Bob Ehrlich won. Shortly after Paris Glendenning. Republicans are doing a great job in winning local municipal races too also. But that's the perception that some people may have, and I would say they're a little bit uninformed.
I'd say that's accurate. So, yeah.
But I digress. But the things that you're doing with the Gunsallus Standard and Restore Maryland is you're giving local Republicans and Republican candidates a voice and a platform to talk about some of our ideas and talk about some of the issues. So I think that's fantastic, and really something that you really can't replace in this political environment.
I appreciate that, and it's, having been elected, I've been the subject of numerous extremely biased newspaper articles. I mean, rug pulls. Yeah. Hey, we're gonna deadlines at this time. Please give us your comment by that time. Article drops several hours before. Oh, they declined to comment. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, I do work, So it's just completely ridiculous, some of the stuff. So, as I mentioned in the first episode, I don't know if you saw it, and if anyone else watching this will, go back to that. But, this is our First Amendment right.
Yeah.
We are exercising that. The freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. Us putting a video together on a podcast, and we're doing just that. It's just a modern version of what our forefathers did during the Revolution. You look at Common Sense by Thomas Paine, and all that kind of things. How else do you get your word out? Well, you got to do it yourself, because there are interests that don't want to lose power in their stranglehold, especially in a state like Maryland. So this right there, is a way for us to just get our voice unfiltered out there, and just speak our minds and get words directly to people that can't be changed. I had another one where I was interviewed for 20 minutes, and they used one word. One word. They wrote a whole article, crafted it a certain way, framed a narrative, and then Council President Gonzalez said it's ridiculous. So it's like, I don't know if that's accurate, So, but it's really just, we just gotta own it. That's what it is. You are someone that embodies that. That's what I really admire about you. That's what I guess drew me to get in touch with you after seeing everything you were doing around the state, because this is important to me. This is where we live. This is where I'm raising my kids, and to see the kinds of things that are occurring in our state, coming down, and you see them being discussed just for like a litmus test on how the public's going to respond, is really, really concerning.
It's scary.
So it's this podcast, so people are aware, it's not going to be exclusively just Republicans, conservatives. I reached out to the people I know in my sphere of influence, of course, because that's where you got to start.
Correct.
But I did pull, at least in Talbot County, anyone running for office that's on the Board of Elections website that had an email. I sent the same email to everyone. I'll give everyone the same treatment. Allow you to speak your mind and from the heart, and just have a fair, genuine conversation, because I feel like too many times there are financial interests that are just getting in the way and trying to really frame a narrative. So it's just time that people just got to do things like this themselves. This is on my phone, and I bought some lights online. So it's like it's not hard. Anyone can do it. I highly recommend everyone do this, and just be able to get your word out there, and don't rely on other organizations to do it for you, because at the end of the day, they're going to look out for themselves.
Correct.
So,
correct.
Is there anything that you want to expand upon, or that we haven't maybe perhaps touched on, that you want to make sure people hear from?
Yeah, just the last thing that I want to be able to talk about is that there's a lot of, and I don't want to come off as lecturing too. That's the worst thing you can ever do. But there's a lot of disillusionment with some Maryland Republicans and conservatives that see participating in the electoral process as a zero-sum game, because there's a perception that elections in Maryland are dominated by the Maryland Democratic Party. But I just want everyone to know that the Maryland Democratic Party is as weak as they've ever been. And I say that with so much conviction because when just door knocking 4,000 doors in my district and getting a chance to talk to folks, there are a lot of people who are very angry, upset about what their lawmakers are doing, particularly with Governor Westmore. His approvals are down to 48% now, the lowest it's ever been since he's actually been elected as governor of Maryland. So when I say that the Maryland Republicans are as weak as they've ever been before, there's actually some data behind that too. Right. Also, these people imposed $2 billion in new taxes. That's not a Republican thing, a Democrat thing, conservative or liberal thing. That's something that affects everyday Marylanders. Yep. And we have a unique opportunity right now as Maryland Republicans to go out there, get the word out, connect with voters, and actually bring some common sense and good governance to Maryland. And I just hope everyone joins me in this endeavor and actually fix our state and save our state.
Right. Yeah. And it's wonderful to just see the people that like yourself and the others that you mentioned. I met some of them at your announcement party, and it's nice to see that people are like, I need to get involved. And, but I mean, we could just make things a lot simpler, and you could have just ran for governor. And we could just have it no election day. Just have Fitzgerald and Westmore do an arm wrestling match.
Going at it.
Takes. I think you might get on it. So, I'm really excited to see what you're doing and where things are seemingly heading for you. So this Maryland, this is a guy you should be paying attention to. You should be taking him seriously. He means business, and you definitely don't want to get on his bad side either. So, how can people get in touch with you?
So on Twitter we use it's Fitz Mofor, Fitz Mofor 9A, or on Instagram it's Fitz Fitz Mofor MD, or Facebook Mofor for Maryland. Okay. And then our email is Mofor Mofor 4MD @gmail.com, or our website mofor4md.com. So anytime anyone wants to contact me, I'd love to have a conversation.
Oh, that would be great. So there we have it. This is episode 3 of the Gunsallus Standard. We're on the road today, and just really thrilled at the ability to speak with Fitzgerald and get to help him expand on his messaging to the state and be able to really speak from the heart directly to people. So through an unfiltered lens. So thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate you, boss.
And I think you got it, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So I'm gonna knock on some wood, and we're gonna wrap this up. So all have a nice day. Make sure you subscribe and stay blessed.